This is the Solid Signal podcast for the week of October 4th, 2021. And this week, it's all about Seinfeld and what everybody's talking about with Seinfeld. And I really honestly think it's actually only about 4 people talking, but one of them managed to write an article for The Verge. And then somebody else commented on an old blog post that I made. And I'll get to that part in a minute. So, starting about 3 days ago as I record this, on October 1st, Seinfeld became available for streaming on Netflix, and for the first time in 4K. And so I got to tell you that this is not the first time that Seinfeld has streamed. As a matter of fact, the last couple of months were the first time that Seinfeld didn't stream. So it's not like this is really a story as much as it's kind of just, like I said, a couple of people complaining. For pretty much its entire life on streaming, Seinfeld has been presented in high definition with the same scan that's being used for the TBS and other presentations of it. And this show, just like Friends, was remastered in the early 2010s into high definition. And when they did that, what they did was they used the entire 35 millimeter frame, cut off some of the top and bottom, and gave you that full screen experience. And nobody really complained about that. And I wrote an article. I'm going to put this link up for those of you who are getting this off YouTube, about how really nobody complained at the time, and how if you really were one of those purists who cared how these things were presented, you should be watching them on a 19-inch standard definition television anyway, not on your big flat panel. So one person on The Verge complained, and it was really about one episode. There's an episode of Seinfeld called The Pothole, where in the high definition scan, you can't see the pothole because it's been cropped out. And it's like one shot. And now everybody's up in arms about it. And I want to say I'm not up in arms about it. I'm really not. Because the truth of the matter is, it's just wasn't such a big deal. I got to tell you. Yeah, I want to honor the filmmaker's intent here and make sure that everything's framed the way it should be. But, it's just, I'm still watching Seinfeld, and I'm not watching Seinfeld of all shows for the cinematography. I'm watching it for the performances, for the jokes. This is definitely a case where, I could watch this show with my eyes closed and I'd still basically be okay with that. But I do have one thing that I really want to say about these presentations on Netflix. They are really dark and really grainy, especially in 4K. And I don't remember them being that dark in high definition. And if I could find one in, streaming on DirecTV or something like that, or, on the TBS app or something like that, maybe I'll see if I can do a comparison visually at some point if I get really bored with it. But the bottom line is, it's really dark and it's really grainy, and it doesn't have to be. And the HD masters, I don't remember feeling that way about them, because I was watching them just a couple of months ago. I'm sure you probably were too. And what this says to me is, I'm only guessing what happened here. But, okay. So I should first mention that the HD masters of Friends are not incredibly dark and grainy, and they were done at about the same time. Matter of fact, they're nice and bright, and there's really no noticeable grain, and I don't miss it. It's really appropriate for the show. And so maybe somebody made the decision consciously that Seinfeld should be darker and grainier than Friends, and I don't buy that either. I think that's just laziness. I'll tell you what I think happened here. I'm going to guess, and just purely guess, that when Seinfeld was remastered for DVD, and that goes back about 15 years ago, that they did 4K scans of the original negatives to re-add titles to them, which is pretty much what they did with Friends. They went back to the film negatives and scanned them and then re-edited them to match and added new titles. And that's one of the reasons it looks as clean as it does. And I'm willing to bet they did the same thing with Seinfeld. They scanned the film, they recut it to match the original video, and then they put it out on DVD at that time in the 4:3 aspect ratio. But I'm willing to bet that what they did was they scanned it in 4K at that time. Just kind of thinking, oh, right, this is the highest quality level we can scan it, and we don't know if we're going to need it, so we're going to scan it. And then they did the HD masters, and when they did the HD masters, I'm willing to bet that they color timed it back to the way that it was in the original taped broadcasts, and they still had those. And they probably did a small measure of grain reduction because that was really in vogue at the time. And so the episodes of Seinfeld that are airing on DirecTV, for example, don't suffer from excessive grain, and they don't seem exceedingly dark. And yet the Netflix presentation does. And I think that now when Netflix got these things and they said, okay, well, here are all these 4K masters with all the titles and everything like that, we don't need to do anything. And they didn't. And it shows. And I feel like somehow down the line, it wasn't communicated that when they were doing the HD masters, that they did some level of grain reduction and some color timing on these. Because I'm not going to call them unwatchable. They're not. And I would like to stress again that for the most part, I really don't care, because I don't watch Seinfeld as much as I listen to Seinfeld. It's all about the words. But, just so happens that over the weekend, I watched an episode of Friends in high definition that was presented in the late 1990s originally. And I watched an episode of Seinfeld that was presented in the late 1990s, and there was just a huge difference. And remember, these things used to just air like right next to each other. I mean, the half hour away from each other, and they were similar in the way that they looked on television. Nobody said in 1996, oh, Seinfeld looks dark and grainy. It's just not what we said. We didn't think about it at the time we had standard definition televisions. I do not believe, honestly, not for 1 minute, it was an artistic decision. I think Netflix followed the path of least resistance here and presented the 4K masters that they were given without making any change to them whatsoever. And they should. I'm not a massive fan of grain reduction. I think if you do too much grain reduction, then it looks like videotape and it changes the character of the show a little bit. But I am a fan of doing moderate grain reduction, especially when the grain is so prominent that it really takes away from the visual presentation of the show. These things were shot on 35 millimeter, and they were lit for television, but still, 35 millimeter film at the time, it was fairly grainy stuff. And I think a small amount of grain reduction would be appropriate in a case like this, and a small amount of color timing, not to make it look like a sunny day and, kind of give it that soap opera or 1970s videotape look, but a little bit, just a little bit, to take care of excess darkness, excess saturation that crept in when the negatives were scanned. I just don't think that was done, and I think that it should. The good thing here is there's a lot of people all of a sudden who are clamoring for Netflix to release the 4:3 masters as well as the 16:9 masters, mostly because Disney did this with The Simpsons. They had gone ahead and cropped all the old standard definition Simpsons, and then they went back and put in the 4:3 masters instead. So there's a lot of people talking about it. And if they're doing that, maybe, just maybe somewhere somebody will talk about maybe doing a little bit of color timing and a little bit of grain reduction. I don't care if I watch the 16:9 masters or the 4:3 masters. When Seinfeld went off Hulu, I just started watching the ones that I happen to have on DVD, which are remarkably good quality, which lends more support to my idea that they were originally mastered in 4K and then sampled down to standard definition DVD for the DVD presentations. I think that's when that was all done. And, they're actually pretty good quality considering their standard definition. But hopefully now in 2021, somebody will take another look at these things and say, they just don't have to be so dark and so grainy. The ultimate one would be, I think, if they remastered in 4K with some grain reduction in the 4:3 aspect ratio, which is how people watched it back in the 90s, and with a little bit of color timing just so it didn't seem so dark and oversaturated. I guess I'm going back and forth. Going in circles here, and the podcast has gotten to about 10 minutes in length, which I get it is kind of long. But I'm kind of curious to see what you think about this, since it's a hot button topic this week. And so leave a comment anywhere that you tend to get this podcast. And if you want to you want to subscribe, that sort of thing, I'd sure appreciate it, because, that's the sort of thing that makes me look good to my bosses. That's it for this podcast for this week, and I look forward to talking to you again next week.